My life be like, ooh, yeah, ooh. My life be like, ooh, yeah, ooh.
Hello everybody, this is David Smith here. Welcome to Smithy's Lifestyle. Today I'm going to be talking a little bit about my disability because yesterday was International Disabilities Day, and actually yesterday I spent a little bit of time talking to people, employees of Sir Robert McAlpine, construction company based in London I believe, and it was a really good talk, and we talked about lots of things around disability and adapting to change and this sort of stuff. And I thought it would be really good for me to share some of those thoughts and also expand a little bit more about my disability for you guys, because I probably, because although you might be obvious to some of you may not know what my disability is. So I figured I would go into a little bit of, summary of what my disability is, and explain what it means to me, and hopefully give you some insight. So I have something called cerebral palsy, and the full term of my disability is actually cerebral palsy spastic quadriplegia, which essentially means that I have heightened muscle tone in all four limbs, and I struggle with a little bit of coordination stroke balance. So I became disabled because when I was born, I didn't come out properly. Essentially, I came out arm first, my poor mum, and I had to have an emergency cesarean, and they got me out eventually. But in that period, I had a lack of oxygen to the brain, not surprisingly, and that lack of oxygen just caused my brain a little bit of damage, and the rest, they say, is history, and I've been the same ever since. One of the benefits of cerebral palsy is that it is pretty stable, like it doesn't progress, unlike disabilities like muscular dystrophy. So in terms of lifespan, I believe that I will have a normal lifespan, unless I do something silly. And essentially my disability hasn't changed over the last 30 years. So it means that it's a little bit easier for me to adapt, and I don't have to constantly keep changing equipment and stuff. My needs haven't developed much, so it becomes quite easy to manage because of that. You're not having to constantly get new pieces of equipment, you're not coming from a position where you used to walk and then you can't walk anymore. So I don't miss something that I've never had. So it's being in a wheelchair for me is pretty normal. So I always had an electric chair. I think I got my first electric when I was about 3. I actually was diagnosed with cerebral palsy when I was only 1. My mum knew something wasn't quite right when I was born, and for the first year of my life, but for some reason the doctors didn't believe her until a year old. I guess that's what you get for being born in the 80s. Medical practice wasn't quite the same as it is today. I was eventually diagnosed with cerebral palsy, and that was the start. I believe I went to a special centre for disabled kids when I was quite young in Winchester, where they kind of taught me little things about balance, and got me sitting and kneeling and crawling and all that sort of stuff. And I seemed pretty able at that point, I believe. And then surgeons decided to operate on me because having cerebral palsy, they had a kind of standard operations to do at that point. And they operated on me and then consequently messed up my mobility. So once I had my adductors cut, which was a standard operation at the time to help stop me from dislocating my hip joints, even though my hips never dislocated. It was just a precaution. That operation then screwed up my mobility apparently, and I became a lot less able. I used to be able to climb stairs and stuff, and then I couldn't. So thank you, NHS, I appreciate it. And then it just, I went to a special school in Southampton called Cedar School, And there I kind of, got my first electric chair and just sort of learned, sort of had a sort of basic education. I had physio therapy, which felt more like physio torture. Again, early 90s, physiotherapy is not what it is today, and it wasn't particularly enjoyable, if I'm honest. Very painful and slightly archaic. Then sort of towards the sort of 6 or 7, I actually first started playing boccia at that school. I got my own private wheelchair, which helped mean that I didn't have to push my manual chair up the corridor every day, which was a right pain. The staff used to believe that making me push a manual chair would make me more able, that I'd be able to push a manual chair in the future. And so it would take me 40 minutes to do about a 20 meter walk to the classroom. And obviously I'd get there absolutely knackered. And then they'd moan at me for being late when all they needed to do was come to the bus and push me to the classroom, or get me in the electric chair a bit earlier. But those were the practices in those days. And then as I got older, I realised that the school was quite limiting. I was top of the class in maths. I was actually doing maths that students 3 or 4 years above me were doing and better than them. So eventually my teachers realised that they were having to teach me on my own because I was well ahead of everybody else. And I just felt like I wasn't going anywhere in that school. And it was then I moved to Trelaws really, and that's where I sort of started my progression as a confident young person. I was quite shy when I went there, ironically, and then that was when I got into sport more. My seating was sorted out, and all sorts of things around my personal care were fixed that were never quite fixed before, even though the obvious solution turned out to be very obvious. And then just things got better because they knew what they were doing and they knew how to look after people with disabilities. I flourished, and things started happening for me. And obviously, the boccia career took off, and and I'll explain more about that on another video. But from a disability point of view, now I have a live-in carer who lives with me. And they do like 3 or 4 week stints usually, although in COVID times it's a bit more flexible. And for them, they just help me in the morning, get up, get dressed. Once I'm in my chair, I'm pretty independent, although I need help with like food and stuff and toileting. But yeah, for the rest of it, I'm fairly independent. And yeah, obviously I can now drive myself. I learned to drive when I was 23. Which was a pretty big feat, and again I'll go into more details of that in another video. But it was again all part of the sort of progression of my life really. But in terms of the disability, again, nothing's really changed. The only probably real difference is when I was younger, this wrist was straight, and now it's obviously not. But yeah, that's probably the only sort of progression I've had since. But the wrist has sort of got fairly fixed now. It probably stopped bending when I was about 16, so yeah, it's kind of is what it is, and it's my throwing arm, so it can't be that bad. And yeah, that's probably about it really. In terms of cerebral palsy, there are lots of different types of cerebral palsy. So I have a particular type, but you could put there are people in the street that you'd probably not consider to have a disability, and they could potentially have cerebral palsy. Or there are people that literally are totally immobile, paralysed from the neck down. You need all sorts of tubes and catheters and things to stay alive, really, and almost on life support. And again, that can be cerebral palsy too. And yeah, so cerebral palsy can come with all sorts of complications as well. So I have cerebral palsy with a scoliosis of the spine, which is fairly common. Essentially, the scoliosis is just my back's a bit bent, and as my muscles grew, it kind of got worse. And I used to wear a spinal brace to stop that from progressing too much, because if the curve gets too much, it can squash on vital organs. But it never did, and I refused to have the operation when I was about 18 because of the Beijing Paralympic Games. And since discovered that was a really good decision on my part, and physios have since worked on me, and I've been able to get rid of the brace, and I now sit in a suit, which is like a second skin almost. Like it's a really tight suit that kind of just hugs you and sort of pretends to be a physio on you and just keeps you sitting up better. So yeah, I'm really lucky to have these sort of novel medical ideas, and I'm being able to test them and trial them and use them to my advantage through sport. But yeah, so that is pretty much an overview of my disability with cerebral palsy. It's not by any means the only type of cerebral palsy, and other people have many different types, and you can have it with epilepsy, which can be really quite a challenge. I know someone that's got cerebral palsy can also be, you can get it with Down syndrome as well, so that can be challenging for the person with Down syndrome to kind of being able to manage the learning disability as well as the physical disability. Yeah, it can be tough. So again, it's not one size fits all. Cerebral palsy covers many different areas. There's also a type of cerebral palsy called aphatoid CP. So aphatoid means shaky limbs. So essentially they'll be hyperextensive, so they'll be able to stretch their arms in many different ways and have really long limbs, but they won't have any control or very little control over them, so they'll be quite shaky and not have that stability that I have potentially. And again, that can be a different challenge in itself. So yeah, and I know I've got lots of friends who have that type of disability, and they manage really well, but it can be a challenge, and usually with those types of cerebral palsy, there's a speech impediment to go with it as well. Yeah, that can be a double-edged, an extra challenge for them to manage. So yeah, cerebral palsy is a very broad church, and I won't pretend to know all of the different types. But like I said, mine was as I described it, and I hope you find it interesting and informative. And again, if you have any other questions regarding my disability or anything else, feel free to comment in the description, and I will get back to you with another video with a bit more detail potentially. Cheers, have a good evening, catch you later, goodbye.